Hello everybody and welcome to my latest video. This one is about modern paganism in Britain. This video uses my own anecdotal evidence. Over the years I've known a number of pagans who have worked in different jobs, IT, shop work, schools, offices and garages, but very few would discuss the subject openly with colleagues. I have even known some pagans who went along to church regularly and got a lot out of the services, and even some who were active within the congregation. But none of them discussed what they really thought with other congregants. Because of this reluctance to talk about their faith, even today the pagan religion in the UK can be quite mysterious, and not many people know much about the religion. They just see on the news every year thousands gathering at places like Stonehenge, see the odd prayer ribbon when they walk in the countryside, or half remember that a tradition they are observing has pagan origins. But what do pagans actually get up to? What do they actually believe? And how does their faith actually work? Keep listening and I will answer all of these questions and more. Britain has played a crucial role in exporting the modern pagan religion throughout the Anglosphere in particular, and the wider Western world more generally. Key modern pagan traditions like Wicca and modern Druidry were revived here in Britain and have had a significant impact on the community throughout the world. For myself, I grew up fairly close to Glastonbury, so I was surrounded by a fair bit of pagan influence growing up. Over the years since, I've moved away, but I've also made pagan friends in the place where I live now, and I've always found it an interesting religion to learn about and to interact with. And that's why I wanted to make this video today, to share some of its story as I understand it, along with some facts and insights that people might not know. So, why make this video at all? Well, according to the 2021 census, there are over 100,000 people in the UK who identify as pagan, or with one of the many pagan denominations. That makes it the 8th largest religion in the country, a religion growing in size and influence, and is now an optional element of the national curriculum in Cornwall, where paganism is regarded by many as being the second biggest faith community in that county. When we talk about that figure as well, the over 100,000 people figure, far from an exaggeration, many academics might argue that the real number of pagans in this country is actually much higher, and pagan organisations tend to agree. A lot of people who practice this religion don't record it on official forms, even something as anonymous as the census. That's often due to fear of discrimination. Pagans are very aware that their faith has historically faced significant prejudice, and in some ways still does today. I remember myself when I was working in IT and discussing my home county with a colleague, and she started talking about Glastonbury and how she couldn't believe the people there actually talked about fairies as if they were real. She really was quite scathing in her attitudes towards belief in the Fae, an attitude I'm certain she wouldn't have displayed towards more well-known faith communities. I would like to say at that point that I stood up for my pagan friends and that I pointed out to her that Fae were better understood as land spirits rather than the walnut-sized willowy winged woman you might see in Disney films. That belief in the sacredness of the land was actually quite common in many cultures around the world. I would like to say that I said that, but sadly I did not. Even as something of a sympathiser, as I am for anyone who has got an earnest belief and conviction. I felt I had no choice but to politely change the subject and move the conversation along. I guess that cowardice on my part shows somewhat the stigma that still does exist around this whole area, even now. As a response to this stigma, pagans themselves often tend to be very quiet about their faith, not discussing it with others and shying away from the limelight. When researching this video, I looked for information about any pagan celebrities, and I couldn't find any outside of the New Age or self-help world. Now, I'm sure that there will be more than 0 pagan celebrities in existence, but it might well be that those celebrities who do share this faith might simply not want to discuss their faith openly, perhaps because of that stigma. I saw this shyness firsthand when I once observed a Sabbat ritual, where a student who was also along observing asked to take photos. When the student said this, at first one person said no, and then another and another, and before long, not one of the 15 or 20 people who were attending this ritual remained willing to be photographed. And that showed me just how private many pagans are about their faith. For these reasons, despite the faith being more common than many realise, few people outside of it have anything more than a vague knowledge of it. If this is something you are interested in though, I will share with you now some of the things that I have learned from reading about and enjoying friendships and observing modern day pagans. Many of the most influential modern pagan traditions were revived here in the UK before spreading worldwide. People who know about Christianity often think about denominations, different types of Christians, Protestants, Catholics, sometimes Orthodox, are all different types of belief in that same religion. But when we talk about paganism today, paganism is actually more like 4 or 5, if not more, different religions grouped under the one umbrella term pagan. These are the main branches you're most likely to come across. Pagans call these branches paths. The biggest is Wicca, founded by Gerald Gardner. If you think of magic, rituals or spellcraft, that's usually what people associate with Wicca. Films like The Craft are very much inspired by it. Then there's Druidry. You'll often see Druids celebrating the summer and winter solstices at Stonehenge or other stone circles, holding their ceremonies at these ancient sites. Another branch is Heathenry, which is about reviving the old pre-Christian gods of Northern Europe, essentially restoring the native religions of our region. Shamanism is also significant within modern paganism. It's based on the idea of an ancient global religious practice that predates recorded history. You still see echoes of it today in Siberia or among Native American traditions. Modern practitioners believe we can learn from those traditions and restore aspects of shamanic practice. What all these strands share is a desire to re-establish pre-Christian traditions. They also tend to have a more flexible view of divinity without a single source of truth, like a prophet or a book that is beyond question. The Pagan Federation itself defines paganism as those following a polytheistic or pantheistic nature-worshipping religion. Polytheistic means believing in many gods as opposed to one, while pantheistic sees God as one with the natural world, the idea that the universe itself is divine. It's a bit like saying, just as all the cells in our body together make us, the whole universe makes God. Today, although paganism is often shown on TV in the context of solstice gatherings, and people might imagine shady rituals in dark woods, in reality, the most common place you'll encounter pagans is likely in a pub. Many local pagan groups, called moots, meet regularly in pubs, working men's clubs or other places for social gatherings, and to learn more about their faith from each other in a relaxed setting. So as you can see, paganism is incredibly diverse, with traditions that can sometimes be radically different from each other. So what tends to unite these different pagan paths? Although pagans generally seek to revive our pre-Christian religion, one factor they are painfully aware of is that we simply don't know much about what people actually worshipped or how they understood religion before Christianity arrived in Britain. We have fragments of information, but so much has been either lost or sadly suppressed that we have nothing even approaching a complete theology. This means, in the absence of a unified belief system, what often unites pagans today is shared practices. Orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. The best example is the Wheel of the Year. Many traditions use different names for the festivals, especially heathens, but almost all pagans recognise and remember this annual cycle of 8 seasonal celebrations. Most people are familiar with the summer and winter solstices, the longest and shortest days of the year, when pagans often gather at sacred sites. But in fact, there are 8 festivals in total. Yule on December the 21st, the winter solstice, closely connected with Christmas traditions. Imbolc on February the 2nd, a festival celebrating pregnancy and the coming birth of new life. Ostara, the spring equinox, often called Pagan Easter, celebrating new life and fertility. The goddess Ostara is linked with rabbits, which may explain the Easter Bunny connection. Beltane on May the 1st, a fertility festival sometimes involving fire jumping rituals, celebrating passion and the vitality of youth. Letha on June the 21st, the summer solstice, marking the height and fullness of life. Lammas on August the 2nd, the harvest festival, giving thanks for the crops and the fruits of hard work. Mabon on September the 21st, the autumn equinox, marking the end of the harvest and the earth's return to rest. Samhain on October the 31st, better known as Halloween, this is seen as a festival of death and ancestor communion. Pagans often believe that at this time the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest, making dreams, visions or contact with ancestors more likely. Unlike horror film ghosts, these encounters are usually seen as loving and familial, not frightening. The Wheel of the Year also symbolises the human life cycle, with each festival reflecting a stage of growth, maturity, decline and renewal. It is also significant that this cycle does not commemorate any person's achievements, battles won, revelations obtained or miracles performed. What is important and centred here is not human events. It is the eternal, unchanging cycles found in and ordained by nature itself. This cyclical view of the Wheel of Time is something most pagans share, even if they call the festivals by different names. Another uniting factor is sacred places. Pagans often return to ancient sites regarded as holy by their ancestors. Famous examples include Stonehenge, Glastonbury, thought by some to sit at the crossing of key ley lines, Castlerigg in Cumbria, Thornborough Henge in North Yorkshire, and various sites in Cornwall. Even though we can't know exactly what ancient people did at these places, modern pagans value continuing that sense of veneration and continuity. At many of the moots I have attended, I rarely refuse a social invitation. I'm not that popular enough to turn my nose up when invited out. I have heard pagans talk about their visits to many of these sites with affection, some even going back regularly if a particular site speaks to them. Sacred spaces don't necessarily have to be big and ancient locations. I also know others who have found a quiet spot near their home that they will go to for special occasions. The group that I witnessed doing a Sabbat ritual simply used a clearing in a wood near one of their homes. Whatever method they use, however, most pagans feel sacred spaces are important and will recognise and even take pride in these major ancient sites in a similar way to how a practicing Christian might think about a cathedral. Another factor uniting pagans is a desire to practice religion without letting dogma get in the way. There's a shared openness to different understandings of the divine. This varies across traditions, but is rarely prescriptive. Druids often emphasise Arwen, a kind of spiritual force which can feel almost monotheistic. Wiccans usually recognise many gods and goddesses as manifestations of a deeper, ultimate source, often expressed as the god and the goddess. Heathens focus on a pantheon of distinct gods alongside concepts like weird or fate, without a single divine power orchestrating everything. Paganism allows for a spectrum of theological views, united by a willingness to embrace multiple divine realities. The important thing is if the individual feels connected with the tradition and has a desire to embrace it. Finally, a deep sense of shared history ties pagans together. Whether or not every detail of that history is accurate, there's a strong feeling that their faith has endured over 1,000 years of suppression, during which it was outlawed and actively stamped out. Many pagans believe they didn't lose a theological debate, rather their traditions were forcibly replaced. This legacy reinforces the modern pagan's cautiousness. They are often reluctant to declare their beliefs publicly and can be suspicious of authority. Another reason there are probably far more pagans in the UK than official statistics suggest. Many simply prefer to keep quiet about their faith, especially, for example, on intrusive census forms asking intrusive questions. So, what about pagan ceremonies? The truth is, you may well have taken part in a pagan ceremony without even realising it. For example, if you've ever been wassailing, like the people outside this pub in the bottom right, then you've taken part in a pagan ceremony. The tradition of blessing apple orchards and scaring away evil spirits goes back to pre-Christian times and was meant to ensure a good harvest. Well dressing is another example of this sort of thing. Pagans also point out that Christmas and Easter, Yule and Ostara in pagan terms, have strong pre-Christian roots. Indeed, bringing Christmas and Easter trees into your home is a pagan tradition. Many pagans would argue that the true meaning of Christmas goes back to pagan belief. So, if you've ever celebrated Christmas or Easter, well, perhaps you've already taken part in a pagan tradition. If you've ever worn a wedding ring, that too is a pagan practice. Rings were originally used as magical tokens in ceremonies to bind the giver to the receiver. The circle symbolised a commitment without end. something that was carried directly into today's wedding customs. In fact, the Puritans of the 17th century knew this, so much so that at one point many Christians wanted to ban wedding rings entirely, seeing them as a pagan practice that should be discarded. Halloween? Pagan origins. Communion? Well, that one's controversial. I once met a group of Druids who told me that communion was practiced by pagans before Christians. I can't say for sure how historically accurate that is, but it's certainly an interesting claim. The pagan version of communion is very simple. A drinking cup or horn is passed around with the words, "May you never thirst," followed by bread with the blessing, "May you never hunger." Bread is still preferred as it is with Christian communion, but mead is generally used in pagan communion instead of wine. Perhaps that desire to claim all sorts of ancient traditions is another thing that unites pagans. The absolutely dogged determination to claim every tradition in the world has pagan origins. Christmas, communion, childbirth. Okay, perhaps not the last one. That said, some of these claims definitely are true, so you may well have participated in many pagan ceremonies in your lifetime without even knowing it. When we talk about the different pagan paths, what exactly are these paths and what do they look like? The first and probably the most widely known is Wicca. The word itself comes from an old Anglo-Saxon term meaning wise, the idea being that those who practice Wicca are, at least in theory, wise people because they have knowledge of magical arts. Wicca was founded by Gerald Gardner in 1951, just after Parliament repealed the ban on witchcraft, which incidentally Winston Churchill was a major supporter of repealing that ban. As soon as the ban was lifted, Gardner announced the revival of Wicca. He claimed that he had secretly met with a coven of witches in Dorset who had initiated him into their rites. The reality is probably a bit more complicated. Gardner seems to have drawn a lot of his material from the places he visited while serving as a civil servant across the British Empire prior to the Second World War. His teachings, however, spread widely, and many covens were established following either his original work or later adaptations of it. Wiccans are often recognised by their use of altars in their homes, their practice of ritual magic, and their ceremonial gatherings. This has sometimes led to accusations that they might be doing something dangerous or black magic. Wiccans usually respond by pointing to what's known as the law of threefold return, the idea that whatever you do magically comes back to you 3 times over, and the idea being that that would tend to discourage anyone from trying anything too sinister. After all, no one wants to be turned into a frog 3 times in a row. Not everyone agreed with Gardner, of course. After all, where there are 3 pagans in a room, there are usually at least 5 different opinions, and offshoots of Wicca soon developed. Alexandrian Wicca, which traces its own lineage, Dianic Wicca, which focuses heavily on female empowerment and feminist religious ethics, and Sex Wicca, which is not fetishists with a witch kink, but a type of Wicca that tries to revive pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon witchcraft. One thing I find interesting about Wiccans is how much emphasis many of them place on initiation. They are very proud of who initiated them and of tracing their spiritual lineage back to Gardner himself. The difficulty is that there isn't much evidence Gardner had any genuine ancient tradition behind him. He seems to have created Wicca out of his own experiences and the ideas he encountered. Either way, Wicca today is a very sincerely practiced path with ornate and meaningful rites that many people hold deeply important. Druidry is another major pagan path. You can see it represented at places like Stonehenge during the winter solstice. And I think we can all agree, standing out there all night in the freezing cold and snow requires more than a fair amount of dedication. Druidry has an older tradition than Wicca and is not as focused around the practice of magic. The first Druidic order to be re-established was the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in 1781, and was very much influenced by the thoughts and writings of William Stukeley, who was also one of the founding figures of archaeology. He believed that by studying sites like Stonehenge and trying to understand what the ancient Druids were doing, we could use that knowledge to inform our own religious practice today. The biggest Druidic movement today is called Obod, the Order of Bards, Oviates and Druids. Those three titles represent different stages of learning within the order. Obod actually runs a course that guides someone through each stage. The first level is the Bard. To become a Bard, you need to read and learn the Mabinogion, a key collection of Welsh mythology, and learn the stories and legends behind Druidry. Then you practice retelling those stories and passing them on to others. That storytelling tradition is at the heart of bardic training. Once you've mastered that, the next level is the Oviate. Oviates specialise in the healing properties of plants, trees and herbs. You've probably heard the old stories of druids cutting mistletoe. Well, in today's Druidry, that kind of herbal knowledge is very much part of the Oviate's role. Finally, the third level is to become a full Druid. At this stage, you've mastered the arts of both Bard and Oviate, and now you learn the higher ceremonial practices, giving you the status of a full Druid. Some very colourful figures have come out of modern Druidry. For instance, the man you can see here knighting this woman legally changed his name to King Arthur Pendragon. He did it to emphasise his connection with the legendary Arthur, and some say he even claimed to be Arthur's reincarnation. I met some of his followers at Stonehenge once, and they told me that that's definitely an exaggeration. I'm not sure what the truth is, but either way he has a substantial following. He's sometimes seen as controversial, even extreme, but he has achieved quite a lot, such as securing the right for people to access Stonehenge and other sacred sites. So, while he divides opinion, he's also respected as someone who gets things done. So, Druidry has a structured system of learning, bards, oviates and druids, and it remains deeply tied to ancient monuments and to the landscape of Britain. Heathenism is another Reconstructionist pagan faith, but instead of looking back to the pre-Roman Druids for inspiration, heathens look to the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. The modern revival of heathenism began in the 1970s, not only in Britain, but also in Iceland, Scandinavia, Germany and the United States. One of their main symbols is Thor's hammer. You can see it in the picture at the top left, which is very strongly associated with this path. Now, it's worth pointing out that within heathenism there's a significant divide between what are called folkish heathens and inclusive heathens. Folkish heathens see their religion as ethnocentric, something tied to both blood and land. That means they often exclude people who aren't of the same ethnicity as the local population from participating in their rites. For example, someone from a migrant background in Britain might find themselves less welcome at a heathen bloat than someone with Anglo-Saxon or German ancestry. But that's not the whole story, and that doesn't apply to all heathens. Many heathens are inclusive, welcoming people of all backgrounds to join their rituals and practice alongside them. Still, it is an ongoing point of contention within the community, and one that makes heathenism stand apart from Wicca or Druidry. Heathenism also tends to emphasise what could be seen as more traditional values, in contrast to the more libertarianish Wiccan ethics. But it shares with other pagan paths an ecological ethos. Heathens often talk about the trinity of people, gods and land, and with that comes a strong emphasis on protecting and respecting the natural world. Some express this preference, preferring organic food, avoiding things that have been chemically processed or supplemented. Instead of moots like other pagans have, heathens gather for bloats, their religious festivals, which often line up with the Wheel of the Year, but under different names. Bloats tend to also include an element of feasting and definitely alcohol consumption, usually mead. Runes are also closely associated with heathen practice. These are ancient Germanic writing systems, but unlike our alphabet, each rune also carries a deep symbolic meaning. That means they can also be used for divination, as you can see in the central picture, where someone is holding runes ready to drop or cast them in order to read fortune from how they land. Another distinctive heathen practice is boasting. During rituals, a large drinking horn is passed around. Each person will introduce themselves, offer good wishes to the group, and then take a sip before passing it along. As for their gods, heathens look to the same pantheon worshipped by the Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, and ancient Germanic peoples. The three most popular are Thor, Freya, and Odin, and you could see some idols of them here. Another path that has become increasingly well known and important within modern paganism is shamanism. Shamanism takes its inspiration from deep time and draws on the practices of peoples least affected by technological advance. It often looks to pre-Christian Native American and Siberian traditions for its rituals. What's striking is that many of these ancient faiths, separated by geography, share remarkable similarities. And practitioners tend to feel that because these traditions converge so closely, these oldest forms of religious practice carry a kind of universal truth. Within shamanism, there's a strong emphasis on things like vision quests, journeying in the astral plane, and seeking contact with the spirits of ancestors or guides. It places great importance on self-development, meditation, and personal transformation. The belief is also quite syncretic. It blends well with other pagan traditions. Someone might follow shamanism alongside heathenry, druidry, or Wicca, or simply pursue it on its own. For many pagans I know who use and practice shamanism, they find it a really good way to connect to the land, their ancestors, and the spiritual world in a globe that is becoming increasingly secular, materialistic, and cold. So, how many pagans belong to each of these paths? Straw polls I've done over the years with pagan friends have revealed the answer is something like yes. Probably 90% of pagans I have asked say they tend to dip in and out of all of them. It's rare to meet someone who says, I'm just a heathen, or I just like druidry. Most people take a bit from all of these paths, and sometimes even from other religions. I've even seen a home altar that was only dedicated to Jesus, because the person who owned it had converted to Christianity, but liked to keep many of her pagan culture's practices and traditions going. That particular woman, while having converted, was still accepted at moots and other gatherings as a pagan, just one who happened to only worship Jesus. This showed me the sheer variety of beliefs that are accepted within paganism are as unique as the individuals who practice them. It's one reason why scholars of religion often find paganism frustratingly hard to define, with one pagan apologist saying defining paganism is like herding cats. I once spoke to a street evangelist who told me they especially struggled to engage with pagans because it was so difficult to get a handle on the faith. It's so highly individualised. And that's not surprising when you consider we don't really know the full theology of the ancient peoples whose faiths pagans are trying to reconstruct. People have to feel their way for themselves. So what exists is less of an orthodoxy, a unified set of beliefs, and more of a unity of praxis, a shared focus on practice. How does this practice work then? There are structures within paganism roughly equivalent to churches. Online platforms and communities like WitchTok advertise paganism today and connect people. But in my experience, serious practitioners usually meet in person at moots, and if they make connections there, go on to join rituals and take part in covens. Many pagans don't belong to moots, covens or rituals. They practice individually and are often called hedge witches or hedge pagans, meaning they work independently, like tending their own spiritual hedge. And this is completely accepted in the pagan community. Another group that might stay away from communal gatherings are those practicing traditional forms of paganism, which are usually family-based. These are rare, but highly respected. In traditional paganism, the practice has been handed down through generations, most commonly from mother to daughter, and may have never extended beyond their own individual family. I've met people who learned their faith from their mothers and only later joined a moot when they realised it was part of the same religion. People with that hereditary knowledge are very highly valued in pagan communities as they represent a much stronger link with the past. The key thing to emphasise is that for everyday pagans though, faith isn't dogmatic. There's no strict must do or must believe. It's intuitive and personal. One pagan once told me, if you see a sunrise and feel it, that experience itself is enough. So, what do pagans do? One thing people might notice in everyday life are those hippie gift shop type places. When I first moved to the town I lived in now, that's actually how I first started to engage a little with this world. There was a shop in town and I popped in out of curiosity and had a chat with the guy behind the counter. He said to me, if you want to know more, even if you're not a pagan, you're welcome to come along to the moots we hold. Where I had lived before, there were a lot of pagan friends I had made growing up, and being in a new town, I wanted to meet new people and make friends, and so that's how I started going along, gradually learning a lot more about this interesting group of people over the next few years. A lot of towns have these sorts of shops. You probably know the ones I'm talking about. You walk in and there's this strong smell of incense, shelves of crystals, maybe a few statues, homeopathic remedies, essential oils, all that kind of thing. And it's interesting, considering the 2021 census, put pagans at around 100,000 people in the UK, that's clearly not enough to support the number of witchcraft supply shops you actually find. While I'm sure most of their customers are, just like me, people who are curious, clearly, from the number of repeat customers they have, many more people are buying into this worldview than official figures suggest. Solstice celebrations are another time when pagans become visible. Once or twice a year, large numbers gather at places like Stonehenge, Avebury or Glastonbury, celebrating the shortest or longest night of the year by watching the sun set and rise again. It's a spectacular social and spiritual event. Pagans also like to visit ancient sites, trying to feel what their ancestors might have felt in those places. I remember going with my mother to Avebury in Wiltshire. It's an incredible sight, a village within a massive stone circle. At one point we noticed someone had lit a candle in a crevice of one of the stones, and the wax had dribbled down. Part of me worried about damaging the stone, and authorities do discourage this kind of thing on the stone itself. However, we also need to recognise the intent. The person was showing a desire to respect and connect with the people who built the stones. Whatever our views on preservation, there's clearly something important in honouring that connection to our ancestors. Another thing many but not all pagans do is practice magic. As I mentioned earlier, magical practice often has a therapeutic element. I don't know the details of how it's supposed to work, but generally it involves combining symbolic herbs or items in specific ways to release energy or focus intention. Ultimately, it seems to me to be about people coming together, talking through the problems and challenges in their lives with each other, and finding symbolic or ritualistic ways to process them. And at the end of the day, that's a positive thing. Although there isn't a set doctrine or uniform set of beliefs in paganism, we simply don't know exactly how people in ancient times dealt with life or would have thought about the issues we face today. There are some interesting beliefs held by modern pagans that are worth discussing when exploring the faith. A big question people often ask about any religion is what it believes about life after death. If you remember from my Shinto video, Shinto didn't have one single answer. It had a number of possibilities, and paganism is very similar. One idea in the pagan afterlife is that when you die, your spirit goes to the Summerlands, which are located to the west. This comes from ancient beliefs that the spirits of the dead travelled westward from our islands towards where the sun dies at the end of each day, or as we would say today, sets. There's also the idea of reincarnation, the belief that we come into this life for a purpose, learn lessons through our experiences, and then return to the spirit world when we pass away. Some pagans believe our souls can then choose to return in a new life, continuing their development. In some older Celtic traditions, reincarnation was thought to occur within one's kinship group, so you might return as a distant descendant, for example. Both these views of reincarnation are definitely present in the modern pagan community. Interestingly, belief in reincarnation is becoming more popular in wider society all across the different nations of the continent of Europe today. But unlike the Far Eastern concept, where you might reincarnate as animals and eventually work your way to being human, the European idea of reincarnation tends to be exclusively human, closer to the old Celtic idea than the Far Eastern one. Another view of the afterlife that's pagan comes from heathen traditions. The honoured dead might go to Valhalla, or those who've lived a regular life would end up in a place called hell. Hell with one L rather than two. This isn't the Christian hell of eternal punishment, it's more of a land of water and mists. In some heathen stories, there's also Nidhogg, a place with roots and serpents where truly malicious souls might end up. But reaching Nidhogg requires a life of deliberate wrongdoing and bad attention. It's definitely not a default outcome. So, in paganism, ideas about the afterlife are diverse, deep, and often quite compassionate, reflecting a wide range of historical and cultural influences. Another aspect we often think about with religion is our relationship with God, or in the case of paganism, with the gods. And unsurprisingly, pagans again have a variety of ideas about how this works. If you talk to a druid, for example, they might talk about the concept of Arwen, a kind of life force. Their focus isn't so much on praying to a specific deity for help, but on aligning themselves with the natural energy of the world and working with it, rather than trying to manipulate it purely for personal gain. For most pagans who believe in many gods, it's a bit more practical. You choose the god appropriate to your need. If you want a safe sea journey, you might pray to the god of the sea. If you want success in a struggle, maybe Thor might be a good choice. And if it's matters of love, Freya, a love goddess, might be the one you call on. It's very much a which god for which purpose kind of approach. One thing I have noticed is that gods in paganism don't tend to dominate the lives of pagans in the same way that the god of monotheistic religions does. In Christianity, for example, your relationship with God is often central to everything you do. In paganism, as long as you respect and revere the gods, they do their own thing and you do yours. A deep, all-consuming relationship with a single god is rare in the pagan faith. Where pagans often do focus more closely, though, is on local spirits or household spirits. Ancient Romans believed in spirits of the house, and in Japan today, people believe in household kami. Pagans often leave offerings for these household spirits. I know one pagan who lost her car keys and left offerings for the house spirits asking for her help in finding these keys, and she told me that she found her keys just a couple of hours later. Of course, it doesn't always work smoothly. I spoke with another woman who told me that if you regularly leave offerings and then suddenly stop, the spirits can get upset, and then strange little mischievous things might start going wrong around your house. So I guess the moral of the story is, don't spoil your house spirits. I think one thing that's worth bearing in mind about paganism is the balance between innovation and heritage. Paganism's relationship with archaeology is actually a really interesting one. Now, a lot of people, particularly those who are unkind to pagans, might say that there's no archaeological evidence for any of this, and that modern pagans have no right to call themselves druids, for example, because their practices are so different to what happened centuries ago. I think that's probably not entirely fair. One fascinating example is William Stukeley, who influenced the early revival of Druidry and inspired modern druidic orders. He was also one of the fathers of archaeology. Why? Because he wanted to understand the religious practices of the ancient druids. He excavated sites like Stonehenge and Avebury to try and learn what the druids had done there and how he could honour their practices in his own religious observances. Today, that same keenness to learn persists among many pagans I've spoken to. There's a strong desire to understand archaeology, to study how people in the past thought about faith, to connect with ancestors, and to have modern beliefs and practices informed by these discoveries. It's a faith that looks back to history for inspiration, even if it's not trying to recreate the past exactly. I've met one pagan whose faith inspired her into becoming an archaeologist, and today is well on her way to becoming a respected figure in her field. One thing she spoke of is working on an excavation of an ancient Romano-British house she found, when she found to her surprise a woman's remains sat facing the door. When she found these remains, she was able to complete a brief ritual to show respect to this woman, and felt a real connection to her and her life. This ethic of respect for ancestors is common to many pagans, just as it is in Shinto. This ethic has led some modern pagans to campaign to ensure that remains and artifacts are treated respectfully. For example, in the photo here, you can see a group of druids protesting the display of ancestral remains in a visitor centre at Stonehenge. And yes, there's Arthur Pendragon on the right hand side, rallying to protect those remains. And I have to say, I do have a fair bit of sympathy with their position. It's a fascinating intersection of faith, history and ethics, showing that paganism isn't just about rituals and festivals, it's also about honouring the past while finding a place for it in the modern world. One big thing that attracts many people to paganism is the way it approaches gender and the divine. This is to say something many women involved told me time and again, and a striking feature of many pagan moots is that they tend to skew heavily female. There are far more women than men interested in pursuing most pagan paths, though it's worth noting that heathenism tends to be more of a blokey thing. Even there though, goddesses and the female principle remain central. In most pagan paths, you're more likely to hear people talking about gods and goddesses using both male and female terms. And why not? Women are life bearers. They have an immense role to play. We all came from our mothers, so why not think about us coming from a heavenly mother? Of aspects of life these deities represent as being female as well as male. When pagans talk about the divine, they'll often use the word goddess more than god. Many paths teach about the divine in terms of balance. They'll use terms like the Lord and the Lady, God and Goddess, rather than a single male-centric entity. There's also the concept of the triple goddess, maiden, mother and matriarch. Each stage of womanhood has its own energy, its own qualities, and its own particular strength. That's the idea. There's a male equivalent as well, youth, father, sage, sometimes referred to as the triple god. This idea of seeing the divine as both female and male is a significant draw for many women considering a pagan path. It's a faith that celebrates the full spectrum of human experience, and for a lot of people, especially for women who are uncomfortable with an exclusively male portrayal of divinity, that inclusivity is profoundly appealing. When I was talking to my wife about this presentation and asking her what she thought would be good topics to cover, one thing I realised is that the pagan faith is, in many ways, very much a faith centred around things. There's a reason why one of the biggest ways paganism manifests itself in society is through those gift shops. Pagans use all sorts of trinkets and objects as part of their faith. So let's look at some of these items that are specifically pagan and their meaning. There are many more than only these items, of course, but this is hopefully a fairly representative selection. Books of Shadows, its anonymous name, are a tradition that many pagans follow, and it goes back to times of persecution. Back then, there was no guarantee that someone practicing paganism would be able to pass on the knowledge they had gained, because they might be caught and punished. so they wrote down their spiritual experiences in a book with the idea that someone in the future could find it and learn from it. Today, many pagans still keep these books, which are called Books of Shadows. Why shadows? Because it's a reflection of a life. When we live, we have a shadow, and in many ways, what we write down on a page can be a shadow of the thoughts in our minds. Some books of shadows are quite ornate. This particular example is painted and uses a runic script. But many pagans whose books of shadows I have seen simply use a regular notebook. Traditionally, these books were supposed to be kept secret, so if you have pagan friends who keep a book of shadows, don't be surprised if they prefer to keep that private. Shrines are a significant part of paganism. There aren't many pagan temples, but they do exist, like the Goddess Temple in Glastonbury, among others around the country. Special places are particularly important to pagans, especially natural sites such as springs. These spaces are often used for ritual purposes and for connecting with the divine. Prayer ribbons are one way this connection with the divine manifests. If you've been walking through the countryside and come across a tree or spring adorned with ribbons, that's a place where pagans have tied them as an act of prayer. I remember one time my wife and I were at a spring in Dorset, St Augustine's Well, and talking about the place, my wife was telling me that it was a Christian place, and then she turned around and saw all these prayer ribbons tied nearby. I guess it wasn't as Christian as she thought, which made me laugh a little. In fairness though, perhaps I shouldn't have laughed. These two gentlemen here, members of the Anglican clergy, are attaching prayer ribbons to a tree in their church. During COVID, the local Methodist church near me set up a prayer cross in their grounds and encouraged people to tie ribbons to it as a way of praying for the community. And I was very happy to do that. It's interesting because we often view Christianity and paganism as opposites, but there are aspects of Christianity willing to learn from pagan practice and apply it in their own way. And really, why not? If it works and brings people closer to something positive, where's the harm in that? The next example is a somewhat dramatic one when people think of paganism. Why do they have a sacred knife? In paganism, this is called an athame. Although it looks dramatic, it's purely symbolic and often the edges are blunt. You might see it next to an altar or used ceremonially in a ritual. It is used as being symbolic of the male principle, the female principle being symbolised by a chalice. In the picture, you can see the athame placed on a pentagram, a 5-pointed star enclosed in a circle. This is a common symbol of paganism. The 5 points represent earth, air, fire, water and spirit, with the top point symbolising spirit and positive intentions. The circle around the star represents protection. Wands are genuine pagan artefacts. They're not just something from fairy tales. In pagan rituals, a wand is typically used to focus attention or direct energy. For example, someone might draw a circle with a wand so that everyone present can focus their attention in the same place at the same time. Interestingly, the owner of a pagan gift shop in a nearby town once refused to sell wands to Harry Potter fans. He explained that these are sacred magical artefacts, not toys, which caused a bit of a stir in the local community, and probably didn't hurt his sales figures from all the Harry Potter fans coming in to try and circumvent his ban. Jewellery can play an important role in paganism and is often quite symbolic. For example, the main picture shows a necklace featuring a hagstone, a naturally occurring stone with a hole through it, which is believed to bring protection. The necklace may also include various symbols, in this case representing different groups of ancestors. Pagans might wear special jewellery for formal occasions such as rituals to help denote the space and time as sacred. However, big cumbersome jewellery is generally not worn every day. For more subtle self-expressions, some pagans might wear discreet pieces, like a small necklace under a shirt or a single earring with a pagan symbol as seen in the picture here. One of the nice things about pagan jewellery is that it can be worn subtly, so the meaning isn't always obvious to those unfamiliar with the symbols. One woman I know likes to wear a necklace with a cat and a small pentagram. She felt that wearing this reminded her of her connection to her faith throughout the day, but was subtle enough that others wouldn't notice the significance. Sometimes, as well of course, people might wear pagan symbol jewellery simply because they like the design, without necessarily knowing its significance. I must admit though, that now I know about this, I often look at the jewellery that people are wearing, and if I recognise the symbol, I do wonder. I remember one time I was at a party and chatting to a woman there who was wearing discreet pentagram earrings. At the end of the evening I gave her a blessed bee to say goodbye with, and she reacted with pleasant surprise that I had recognised all along. Altars are another important aspect of pagan practice, and many pagans like to keep one in their home. Similar to the way Shinto shrines can range from the size of a mountain to just a few inches, there's no strict rule about the size of a pagan altar. Typically, an altar will contain items that hold personal significance for the individual. One important aspect is that it often includes representations of the 5 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. Having a dedicated space in the home allows pagans to bring their spiritual practice into their everyday environment, which many find meaningful and grounding. I like that idea. In the Bible, when pagans are mentioned, they are often associated with idols. In reality, idols do play a role in pagan faith, but they are generally not considered gods themselves. Instead, they act as symbols of the gods, and as such, these symbols tend to be treated with respect. For example, in the picture here, we see an idol of the goddess Freya, who is associated with cats, among other things. I like this particular example because it features 2 little cats, and I happen to love cats. You can also see runes inscribed at the bottom spelling her name, F-R-E-Y-A. When I speak with Christians about the pagan religion, I usually explain that while there is no pagan equivalent of a church, the elements of a Protestant church service are replicated in moots, rituals, and covens. A moot is kind of like a sermon, the teaching element of a church service. Pagans get together, usually hear one person speak about an aspect of their faith, discuss it, and often have a drink together. Moots are informal and welcoming. Anyone who turns up can participate. They can take place in a pub, a working men's club, or other social spaces. I've even given talks at moots myself. My Shinto talk tends to be popular, perhaps because I bring sake rice wine along for people to drink. I'm sure that doesn't do any harm. The ritual is the equivalent of the worship elements of a Protestant church service. Unlike in a church though, this worship isn't generally open to the public. These are usually organised by trusted individuals who invite people to join the circle who they feel comfortable with. Rituals usually take place in a secluded natural space away from artificial surroundings or unsympathetic people. As for church house groups, the equivalent of a house group would be a coven, made up of friends who meet for rituals, perhaps monthly or maybe aligned with the wheel of the year. Coven gatherings are usually invitation only, socially focused and very eclectic. There's no rigid agenda. People often share challenges from their lives and use ritual or magical practice to address them, which can be quite therapeutic. But what is the story of the pagan religion? We've touched on this a bit, but from a pagan perspective, they would say that paganism has existed since the dawn of humankind, from the moment people first opened their eyes and saw the sunrise. In Britain, for example, there is evidence of a shamanistic lodge at Star Carr in Yorkshire dating back to around 10,000 BC, suggesting a continuous pagan presence since that time. The first Christians arrived roughly between 50 and 100 AD in the Roman-occupied areas of the island. Over the next 900 years or so, they gradually extended their influence, eventually converting the whole island. After the Norman conquest, fines were introduced for non-Christian rituals, making Christianity the only legal faith in the land. Pagans referred to the subsequent period as the Burning Times, a long era of persecution during which witches were executed and pagan practices were heavily suppressed. While the scale of the persecution may sometimes be overstated, the risks were very real, and death was a possibility for pagans at many points in history. In 1166, the Assize of Clarendon allowed the Church to actively investigate and punish heresy, introducing inquisitors who sought out non-Christian worshippers. By 1324, witchcraft had become legally punishable by death. Sacrifices at springs were repeatedly banned in 747, 1023, 1140, the 1400s, and again in the 1500s. These repeated bans showed that these practices persisted despite legal prohibitions. Even into the 1500s, the authorities were failing to suppress some pagan practices entirely. Probably the most dangerous time to be a pagan in Britain was during the height of the witch hunts led by Matthew Hopkins, the infamous Witchfinder General, between 1644 and 1647. However, the last execution for witchcraft in the country occurred at Pendle Hill in 1727, not long before the first modern Druidic order was formed. These early Druidic practitioners navigated restrictions by presenting themselves as worshippers of a single god, and some modern Druids still even identify as Christian while practicing Druidry. In 1951, Gerald Gardner founded modern Wicca shortly after the Witchcraft Act was repealed. In 1973, Iceland officially recognised heathenism as a religion, marking the open re-establishment of paganism in modern society. Despite these legal recognitions, pagans continued to struggle for access to sacred sites. Between 1977 and 1999, for example, they were forbidden from accessing Stonehenge, prompting police patrols near the stones as seen in these historical photographs. This restriction was viewed by the pagan community as a form of persecution. One particularly notorious incident was the Battle of the Beanfield in 1985, when a convoy of New Age travellers heading to Stonehenge for solstice celebrations was violently stopped by police. Vehicles were damaged, families were separated, and children were affected. A dramatic moment that highlighted the continued marginalisation of pagans. Perhaps most damaging for the community was the satanic ritual abuse panic in Britain between 1984 and 1994. Poor psychological practices encouraged children to invent increasingly extreme stories, which led to the scapegoating of pagans who were wrongly accused of ritual abuse, as society at the time often failed to distinguish between paganism and devil worship. Fortunately, the La Fontaine Report in 1994 quashed these false claims, though the psychological and social scars, families torn apart, custody battles lost, remain in the pagan community to this day. For this reason, it's probably worth saying what paganism is not as much as what it is. Even today, there are misconceptions about it, as my former IT colleague is a testament to. For example, when paganism became an option on the Cornish curriculum, some objections arose when people who felt pagans were trying to push their religion. The reality is that paganism is not evangelistic. It doesn't have a concept of heaven or hell, so there's no imperative to convert others. You don't earn pagan points for recruiting converts, and there's no fear that loved ones are going to a bad place if they don't follow paganism. Religious truth is seen as something which simply is. Another common misunderstanding is that paganism is just a fashion choice. People might see someone wearing pagan jewellery and assume it's an aesthetic statement rather than a sincere spiritual practice. While symbols may be worn for style, paganism is a network of genuine interlocking belief systems with a rich history behind them. It's not comparable to adopting a subcultural look like putting on goth-style makeup and clothes. There's also a perception that paganism is anti-Christian or inherently devil-worshipping. This is inaccurate. Paganism doesn't include the concept of a devil. The idea of a rebellion against a single divine authority doesn't exist in paganism. Even in its most monotheistic expressions, such as certain forms of Druidry. In polytheistic pagan traditions like heathenism, you might have gods like Loki, who might stir mischief, but ultimately he solves the problems he creates, and the problems he creates even to an extent drive the narrative and progress. Satanists and other rebellious spiritual paths do exist, but within paganism, people often view them as somewhat cringe. They don't see the point in defining your identity through opposition or rebellion against a divine force. Paganism is about connection with the sacred, not rebellion for its own sake. So, what do pagans want? If we talk about pagan politics, there's a stereotype that pagans tend to be quite left-wing. In my experience, this is partly because some of the more outspoken internationalist pagans often lean that way. But if you actually talk to people, it's a roughly 50-50 split, just like the rest of society. In Britain at least, paganism doesn't have a strong political connection, although I have heard this may be different in the United States. What paganism does tend to encourage is environmental awareness. Pagans, regardless of political leaning, are more likely to care about sustainability, harmony with the natural world, and taking a long-term view of resources. They're conscious that we have lived on this land for thousands of years, and that we want to live responsibly on this land for thousands of years to come. That just makes sense. When I was researching for this presentation, I couldn't find many surveys of non-pagan attitudes towards pagans. What I did find was a survey of Scottish pagans about what they wanted from wider society. The top answer understanding. They wanted people to understand that paganism isn't a reaction against Christianity. It isn't devil worship, and it isn't about rebellion. Its heart is about the re-establishment and carrying on of a much older tradition. Beyond that, what most pagans want is simply to be left alone, to practice their faith in peace without interference or judgment. They don't want to be policed for their beliefs or treated as outsiders simply because their practices are different. It's not about pushing their religion on anyone, and they're not seeking converts or trying to upset the social order. For many pagans, all they want is to be able to gather in sacred spaces, celebrate the cycles of nature, honour their ancestors, and live according to their own ethical and spiritual values without discrimination. They want their faith to be practiced without fear of persecution, even if it isn't widely understood, and they hope that society can accommodate their diversity without fear, hostility, or interference. In essence, it's about freedom of practice, dignity, and being allowed to live in harmony with the world around them while remaining true to their beliefs. So, to conclude, I hope you found this presentation interesting. I certainly find the pagan faith fascinating. It's a growing faith in our country, and in many ways the biggest religious export from Britain since the Pilgrim Fathers. In that respect, it's something worth learning about and knowing. At its core, paganism seems to me to be about honouring life and the natural world around us, celebrating the cycles of the seasons, relationship with the land, and finding spiritual meaning in the world we inhabit. It's always valuable to understand different religions and how they work. I find it fascinating to see the ways in which people approach faith, the diverse ideas and practices that emerge, and how these benefits shape their lives. Learning about paganism can help us better understand the lives of our pagan friends and neighbours. After all, there are probably far more of them than we might realise. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and as my pagan friends would say, blessed be.